The world came to know his name through red carpets, through immortal perfumes, through suits that looked like invisible armor. But the story of Giorgio Armani did not begin under the glare of spotlights. It began in the shadows of war. He was born in 1934, in an Italy where hunger was the daily currency, and the wail of air raid sirens cut even the most innocent dreams short. He did not inherit fortune, nor a noble surname. The only inheritance he received was the silence of fear. How does a boy who played among ruins, who once wanted to be a doctor, who wore a military uniform without imagining any other fate, go on to build one of the most powerful empires in fashion? The answer is not on the runways, but in his obsession to find beauty in the essential, in what others overlooked. Armani did not sew garments. He erected symbols. Each suit was a manifesto. Each cut, a rebellion against excess. In the 1980s, while the world shouted in neon colors, he whispered in sobriety. He invented the power suit, the garment that turned executives into warriors, actors into gods, women into leaders. Hollywood embraced him. Wall Street idolized him, and his surname was transformed into a synonym for silent power. But behind the brilliance, there was another story. The solitude of a man who sacrificed everything for an unbreakable vision. The wound of losing Sergio Gagliotti, his partner in life and in dreams. And the question that never stopped haunting him: what is an empire worth if the price is to live in solitude? This is not merely the tale of a designer, it is the chronicle of a war child who became the last king of fashion. A man who turned less is more into more than a phrase, into an empire that defied time itself. Giorgio Armani was born in Piacenza in 1934, in a country fractured by fascism and war. While some children inherited velvet cradles, Armani inherited the echo of air raid sirens. His childhood was not an album of happy memories, but a catalog of scars. The streets of his city resembled a strange board game, children playing among ruins, mothers running in fear, fathers returning from work, uncertain whether there would be bread on the table. In that atmosphere of hardship, Giorgio learned his first aesthetic lesson. When abundance is absent, beauty hides in small gestures, in minimal lines, in silent balance. His father worked in a warehouse. His mother kept the home alive with the little they had. There were no luxuries, barely enough to survive. Yet that austerity became a school. Giorgio discovered that true wealth was not in quantity, but in harmony. That gaze, that obsession with the essential would accompany him for the rest of his life. And between hunger and fear, there was a refuge: cinema. Armani slipped away into dark theaters where black and white images offered impossible worlds. Actors in immaculate suits, actresses glowing like goddesses. Those images were not just entertainment, they were promises. The contrast between the poverty of his life and the elegance on screen marked him forever. There was born the intuition that aesthetics could save, that style could redeem existence. From that hardened childhood emerged a different kind of adolescent. Not rebellious, not a dreamer, but disciplined and observant. He learned to read silences, to value sobriety, to search for order in the midst of chaos. While Italy tried to rebuild itself from the ashes, Giorgio carried within him a conviction forged by war. In simplicity lay a power no bomb could destroy. When the war ended, Italy was nothing more than a wounded country struggling to rise from the rubble. Young men like Giorgio had to choose a path that promised stability in the midst of uncertainty. Following his mother's advice, Armani enrolled in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Milan. It seemed logical. To become a doctor, to help others, to guarantee a secure future. But the scalpel was never his. In the anatomy classrooms, surrounded by bones and organs, Armani discovered that his heart did not beat to the rhythm of science. He was disciplined, yes, but his eyes were drawn to details that had nothing to do with blood or cells, but with form, with light, with the surface of things. In that realization, though he lacked the words for it, he understood that medicine would not be his destiny. The army arrived as an inevitable interruption. Like so many young Italians, Armani was drafted and assigned to a military hospital in Verona. There, surrounded by the rigid discipline of barracks life, he absorbed something that would forever mark his style: the value of order, of sobriety, of precision. Each uniform folded with exactness, each row of soldiers aligned with perfection, etched themselves into his mind as aesthetic lessons more than military ones. When his service concluded, he returned to Milan without a degree, without direction, but with a silent certainty. He needed to find a field where his particular vision could take root. Fate led him to La Rinascente, a grand department store that stood as the cathedral of modern consumption in Italy. There, Giorgio started from the bottom, dressing mannequins, arranging displays, folding fabrics. What seemed like a trivial job became his true university. Before the shop windows, he discovered the transformative power of fashion. He watched how a color could light up a woman's face, how a cut could alter a man's posture, how a fabric could change the way someone walked. Armani understood that clothing was not mere ornament. It was a way to reshape identity itself. At La Rinascente, he also developed another conviction. Elegance did not require excess. While other employees marveled at the ostentatious, Giorgio found beauty in what was essential: in clean lines, in restraint, in sobriety. That intuition, born among mannequins and vitrines, would become the seed of his revolution. What appeared to be a detour, the abandoned path of medicine, the military uniform, the humble job in a store, was, in truth, the hidden road toward his destiny. Armani did not yet know it, but he was on the verge of taking the first step that would lead him to reinvent elegance for the entire world. Fate always hides in the most unexpected places. For Giorgio Armani, that place was the textile factory of Nino Cerruti, heir to one of Italy's most prestigious houses. Cerruti, searching for fresh blood, noticed the young man with the serious gaze who had learned at La Rinascente how to read the secret relationship between fabric and body. Armani accepted the challenge without a designer's diploma, without having passed through fashion schools, armed only with intuition and discipline. At Cerruti 1881, he entered the workshop as an apprentice and emerged as a creator. There, among patterns and fabrics of impeccable quality, he discovered his obsession: the natural fall of cloth, the freedom of the body against the rigidity of the garment. While other designers clung to harsh structures, stiff shoulders, and military cuts, Armani began to imagine a different suit: lighter, more human, closer to the skin. It was heresy in a world that still worshipped rigidity, but that heresy would soon become revolution. It was during this period that Sergio Gagliotti appeared, an architect by profession, charismatic by nature, and the great love of his life. Sergio was not only his partner in love, but his mirror and his engine. He saw in Giorgio what Giorgio himself had not yet dared to admit. He was not just a good designer, he was a visionary. And he pushed him toward the abyss every creator fears most: founding his own house. In 1975, with limited resources and in a country still shaking off the scars of war, Armani and Gagliotti created Giorgio Armani S.P.A. It was a leap into the void, but one guided by a clear vision. They did not want to compete with French opulence or British tradition. They wanted to impose an Italian identity built on sobriety, on essence, on silent elegance. That same year, Armani presented his first men's collection, followed soon after by his women's line. The impact was immediate. These suits were different, soft, unlined, with lines that seemed to breathe. Men discovered a new masculinity. Women found a form of power that did not force them to renounce femininity. Armani was not designing clothes. He was designing languages of confidence. Critics looked on with surprise, the public with enthusiasm. Giorgio Armani ceased to be an unknown surname and became a name of its own, a promise. What had begun in the windows of department stores now rose as the seed of a myth. In 1975, something more than a brand was born. An empire was under construction. An empire that, in time, would prove indestructible. The 1,980 seconds were a decade of excess. Colossal shoulder pads, neon colors, exaggerated makeup, ostentatious wealth, and a culture that celebrated waste without shame. Fashion had turned into a noisy spectacle, where each designer competed to shine brighter, to scandalize with more ornamentation, to provoke with greater extravagance. And in the midst of that carnival of spectacle, Giorgio Armani chose silence. While others screamed, he whispered. While others overloaded garments to the breaking point, he stripped them down to their purest essence. That decision, seemingly risky, transformed him into the most powerful voice in global fashion. His weapon had a name: the power suit. Until then, the men's suit had been a rigid uniform. a symbol of authority but also of discomfort. Armani took that archetype and rewrote it. He removed unnecessary structures, softened the shoulders, let the fabric fall naturally. The result was a suit that was light, elegant, and carried power without the burden of rigidity. Men discovered a new masculinity, more sophisticated, less aggressive. It was no longer about looking like a soldier on a battlefield, but about radiating confidence with discretion. But the true earthquake came with women. Armani understood that the world was changing. More and more women were entering offices, conquering leadership positions, demanding their space in the corporate arena. The female power suit gave them a uniform of authority that did not mimic the masculine one but redefined it entirely. By wearing Armani, a woman did not have to renounce her femininity. She could turn it into her most formidable weapon of power. In 1980, the world saw on the big screen what Armani had envisioned. American Gigolo, starring Richard Gere, became a cultural revolution. Gere, his silhouette impeccable in Armani suits, was not only the new modern leading man, he embodied desire, sensuality, and the quiet power of Italian style. The film not only launched Gere's career but catapulted Armani into the heart of Hollywood. From that moment on, red carpets overflowed with his designs. Al Pacino, Diane Keaton, Jodie Foster, even a young Julia Roberts, all found in Armani the perfect way to project greatness without artifice. Every Oscar night, every film festival became a showcase for his vision. Armani was no longer just a designer. He had become the invisible architect of Hollywood's image. And yet, the phenomenon did not remain on the screen. Wall Street executives adopted the power suit as the uniform of success. Lawyers, politicians, entrepreneurs all wanted that suit, the one that seemed to bestow instant authority and unshakable security. The message was clear. Wearing Armani was speaking the language of power. No need to shout with extravagance. It was enough to enter a room in an Armani suit, and your presence would say everything. The extraordinary thing was that Armani triumphed not through excess, but through restraint. While fashion drowned itself in sequins, massive shoulders, and garish colors, he bet on neutral tones, clean lines, and simple cuts. In a world obsessed with more is more, Armani proved that true luxury lay in restraint. The power suit was not just a garment, it was a cultural declaration. It changed the way women presented themselves in the workplace. It changed the way men understood elegance. It changed the relationship between Hollywood and fashion. With the power suit, Giorgio Armani ceased being a promise and became a legend. His designs were not merely clothing, they were a vision of how the modern human should appear before society. A vision that spoke of confidence, of control, of silent power. The 1,980 seconds, which seemed destined to bury elegance under an avalanche of excess, ended up being the decade of Armani. His whisper had become a global shout. From that point on, the world would no longer speak of suits. It would speak of Armani. If the power suit was the spark, Hollywood was the wildfire that carried Giorgio Armani's name across the globe. In the 1,980 seconds, cinema dictated global aspirations. What appeared on the big screen instantly became a universal desire. Armani understood better than anyone that dressing the stars was not mere marketing, it was writing history. The revolution began with American Gigolo in 1980. Richard Gere, wrapped in Armani suits, moved across the screen with a disarming sensuality. That film not only defined the archetype of the modern leading man, it transformed the world's perception of men's fashion. Armani had achieved the unthinkable, turning a suit into a cinematic protagonist. After that stellar debut, the doors of Hollywood swung wide open. Al Pacino, Leonardo DiCaprio, Michelle Pfeiffer, Jodie Foster, Tom Cruise all found in Armani the symbol of sophistication they needed to conquer the screen and the red carpet. Each appearance reinforced the truth. Armani did not just design clothes, he constructed cinematic myths. The Oscars, the Golden Globes, Cannes all became showcases for his vision. Julia Roberts, in her vintage Armani gown at the 2001 Academy Awards, etched one of the most iconic moments in Hollywood's fashion history. By then, Armani was no longer just a designer. He was the guardian of the star's timeless elegance. Photographers knew it well. When someone wore Armani, the photo was destined for eternity. His creations were more than garments. They were armors of glamour, ensuring immortality in the collective memory. But Armani was not content with dressing actors and executives. He understood that the future of fashion had to reach every corner of daily life. Thus were born his distinct lines: Emporio Armani for the young and urban, Armani jeans for a more casual style, Armani Exchange designed for the global culture. Each was a doorway into his universe, all sharing the same DNA: sobriety, elegance, modernity. The expansion did not stop there. Fragrance became another milestone. Acqua di Gio, launched in 1996, became one of the best-selling perfumes of all time. It was not merely a scent, it was an identity. Clean, fresh, eternal. With every spray, Armani reinforced the idea that his empire did not sell products, but an experience of life. The next step was bold: the architecture of luxury. Armani began designing hotels, restaurants, residences. From Dubai to Tokyo, the Armani name was etched into walls, facades, and spaces that reflected his minimalist philosophy. The Armani Hotel in Dubai, housed in the Burj Khalifa, became a symbol of boundless ambition. This was no longer about fashion, but about creating entire worlds to inhabit under his aesthetic. With each project, Armani expanded his territory. No longer just a creator of suits, he became a cultural emperor, dictating how a space, a scent, a lifestyle should feel. What was most remarkable about this expansion was how natural it seemed. Every perfume, every piece of furniture, every building breathed the same language. Clean lines, muted tones, eternal elegance. Armani had accomplished what few designers ever managed: to build a diverse empire without betraying his essence. While others surrendered to fleeting trends, he remained unshaken, faithful to a vision forged in his childhood. That is why, when you look at any Armani creation, be it a watch, a dress, or the lobby of a hotel, the message is unmistakable. True luxury is sobriety. Hollywood remained his greatest stage, but Armani transcended cinema. He became a cultural reference point. Politicians, athletes, musicians, all longed to wear his signature. Beyoncé, Kate Blanchett, George Clooney, even football teams donned Armani suits for decisive moments. His surname ceased being just a brand. It became synonymous with global elegance. To say Armani was to say status, modernity, and silent power. The boy who once sought refuge in post-war cinemas now dictated the aesthetic of Hollywood. The young man who once dressed mannequins in a department store now raised hotels in Dubai. Armani had achieved the impossible, transforming austerity into a planetary empire. By the 1990 seconds and 2000s, Giorgio Armani was no longer just a designer. He had become a cultural symbol, an architect of dreams. The man who turned his surname into an empire that seemed to have no borders. Armani's success was no longer measured by catwalks, but by billions. For decades, Forbes kept his name among the richest men on the planet, his fortune surpassing $8 billion. He was the designer who had broken the mold, not just a creator of beauty, but a relentless businessman. While others sold their fashion houses to conglomerates like LVMH or Kering, Armani stood firm, defending with tooth and nail the independence of his empire. "I would rather Armani die with me than see it in the wrong hands," he once declared, with the icy composure of an emperor who knew exactly what was at stake. Independence came at a high cost, but also with a profound reward: absolute control. Armani decided every collection, every campaign, every expansion of the brand. His Milan headquarters became an austere palace where everything passed under his gaze. No needle moved without his knowledge. To some, this was extreme perfectionism. To others, a form of creative dictatorship. But the truth was simple. That obsession was what held the empire together. Armani did not stop at suits and dresses. He diversified with surgical precision. Perfumes that became icons, watches that spoke of status, eyewear that symbolized modernity, furniture lines that carried runway sobriety into people's homes. Even chocolate bore his name. Everything he touched transformed into part of a coherent universe, an Armani ecosystem where every detail breathed the same language: discretion, elegance, minimalism. And yet, behind that monumental expansion lay a cruel paradox. Armani had built a global empire, but in his private life reigned emptiness. He never married, never had children, and his inner circle remained minimal. In his Milan penthouse, surrounded by sketches and blueprints, the night stretched long and silent. He worked until dawn, examining stitches and fabrics as if every seam carried the weight of his heartbeat. His life was the company, and the company was his life. The deepest wound was still the absence of Sergio Gagliotti. Since his partner's death in 1985, Armani had thrown himself into work as his only means of survival. But that iron discipline was also a refuge against loneliness. Behind every successful runway show was a man returning to an empty home. Behind every perfume sold in millions, there lingered the memory of what was lost. Many described him as cold, distant, almost inaccessible. Yet, those closest to him understood that the armor was nothing but a survivor's mechanism. Armani could not allow himself weaknesses. He had sacrificed intimacy for permanence, love for vision, companionship for control. The price of his empire was solitude, and he bore it with the resignation of one who knows that all power demands sacrifice. That duality made him a legend. The public saw an emperor of luxury, ruler of an independent kingdom in a world dominated by corporations. But behind that image stood a man scarred by loss, a man who found solace only in the perfection of his creations. His office was his temple, fabric his only conversation, the runway his most intimate celebration. Over the years, the figure of the solitary businessman became inseparable from his myth. Armani was not the designer who sought parties or tabloid headlines. He was the monk of luxury, the general of a silent army that marched in discretion. And perhaps that was his greatest victory, proving that one could conquer the world without noise, that one could be a billionaire without selling one's soul, that one could build an empire even if the price was one's own company. The boy who had once trembled beneath air raid sirens was now the man who ruled global fashion. And yet, one question hovered like a ghost that haunted him all his life. What is worth more, an eternal empire, or a fleeting moment of true intimacy? In January 1985, just as the Armani empire was beginning to spread its wings across the globe, the designer's life came to a sudden halt. Sergio Gagliotti, an architect by profession, a born strategist, and his inseparable companion died of AIDS. The news fell like lightning across a sky that had seemed clear. Armani did not just lose a business partner, he lost the man who had believed in him back when he was merely an employee in a department store. He lost the one who had pushed him to risk everything and found his own house. He lost, in silence, the companion of his life. The grief was devastating, but Armani never expressed it in words or in public tears. Italy in those years was still a conservative country, where homosexuality lived in the shadows and AIDS was a stigma spoken of in whispers. Armani, reserved by nature, mourned in silence. He never spoke openly of their relationship, but those who knew him understood the wound was deep, impossible to heal. Instead of collapsing, he sought refuge in the only thing he knew: work. He poured himself into the company with ferocious discipline, reviewing every design, every seam, every strategic decision. It was as if every suit crafted, every show staged, every fragrance launched was a way of keeping Sergio's presence alive. The empire they had dreamed together had to survive, and Giorgio made himself its absolute guardian. But that devotion also isolated him. Armani became even more hermetic, more demanding, more mistrustful. Many collaborators would later describe that after Gagliotti's death, Armani never fully trusted anyone again. The void Sergio left in his personal life also echoed in his professional one. No partner, no friend, no one could ever take his place. In the long nights of Milan, Armani sat alone in his studio, examining fabrics under the glow of a single lamp, as though seeking dialogue with a ghost. That solitude became part of his identity. The armor of the implacable businessman hid, in truth, a man marked by loss, a man who had learned to turn pain into aesthetic perfection. Paradoxically, that wound only strengthened the myth. The public saw an untouchable emperor, master of an independent luxury empire. Yet behind that image of control and grandeur lay a man who had paid an incalculable price. Armani had conquered Hollywood, Wall Street, and the runways of the world, but he had lost his companion of the journey. Gagliotti's death became a turning point. Armani was no longer just a designer, he was a survivor. Every expansion of the brand, every new line, every hotel or fragrance carried with it Sergio's invisible imprint. Armani did not build for himself alone. He built for both of them. And though the world never saw that dedication in writing, every achievement was a silent tribute. The void was never filled. Armani never again had a public relationship, never again shared his intimate life with another. He chose solitude as his shield and work as his only companion. On the surface, he appeared the triumphant businessman. In truth, he was a man who transformed grief into discipline, sorrow into legacy, loss into myth. From that moment on, the name Giorgio Armani ceased to be only a brand and became something closer to a living mausoleum, a constant reminder that great empires are built not only with talent and ambition, but also with wounds that never heal. In a world obsessed with excess, Giorgio Armani chose the opposite path. While other designers competed to see who could add more sequins, louder colors, more impossible embellishments, he stripped them away. He reduced fashion to its essential skeleton, convinced that true elegance didn't need to shout it, only needed to exist. Less is more was not a marketing slogan. It was the synthesis of his entire life. Armani's minimalism was not born of creative whim, but of a biography etched in austerity. His childhood during the war had taught him that the necessary was enough. Hunger had trained him to value every small gesture. Military discipline had instilled in him a love of order and sobriety. From that mixture arose a unique vision: elegance as harmony, not ostentation. Armani suits were silent manifestos. They required no sparkle, no elaborate embroidery. They were clean lines, neutral tones, fabrics that fell with natural grace. Whoever wore them did not feel disguised, but sheathed in a second skin. That was the magic. Armani did not design to impress others. He designed to empower the wearer, a power discreet, invisible, but undeniable. That philosophy redefined the very concept of luxury. At a time when fashion seemed to surrender to theatricality, Armani proved that gray could be more striking than a screaming red, that a stripped-down silhouette could convey more authority than a dress weighed down with adornment. Restraint became sophistication, and silence became the language of power. His minimalism transcended clothing. It became the language of the entire Armani universe. The bottles of his perfumes were sober, geometric, without unnecessary flourishes. His boutiques resembled modern temples, spaces of straight lines, soft colors, where every object breathed serenity. His hotels carried the same seal, interiors that invited reflection and balance. Even in advertising, the coherence was absolute. Black and white photography, intense faces, stripped of artifice. Nothing was superfluous. Nothing was out of place. The influence spread beyond fashion. Architects, filmmakers, interior designers began to draw inspiration from his aesthetic. Armani turned minimalism into a cultural movement that defended essence over abundance, clarity over confusion, permanence over the ephemeral. That fidelity to his vision gave him an irreplaceable place in history. While other designers vanished with the ebb and flow of trends, Armani remained immutable. Each collection was distinct, yet all spoke the same language. That coherence made him timeless, immune to the erosion of years. What was extraordinary was that his philosophy was not only aesthetic, it was personal. Armani was reserved, disciplined, austere in daily life. He needed no eccentricities to draw attention. He never sought to be the protagonist of the spectacle. He preferred his creations to speak for him. And in that silence, he built an empire that became a global reference. In a universe where fashion often confuses itself with noise, Armani raised an empire of sobriety. His minimalism was not absence, it was power. It was not emptiness, it was fullness. With every suit, every fragrance, every space, Giorgio Armani made clear that true luxury never needed adornment. It was enough simply to be. As the decades passed and the map of global fashion shifted, nearly every great house was swallowed by colossal conglomerates. Chanel, Dior, Gucci, Saint Laurent, each illustrious name, fell under the umbrellas of corporations that dictated numbers and strategies. Giorgio Armani, from his fortress in Milan, refused to surrender his throne. His empire would remain independent, no matter the cost. That defiance earned him a title few dared dispute: the last king of fashion. It was no empty nickname. Armani embodied what seemed to have vanished: a designer who not only created, but ruled. His company was not an anonymous machine driven by shareholders. It was the precise reflection of his character. Every collection bore his imprint. Every fragrance passed through his approval. Every hotel answered to his vision. Armani was not a brand, he was a monarchy of sobriety. His legacy cannot be measured in garments alone. He reshaped the way society understands power. He transformed the suit into a universal symbol of authority, redefined femininity by granting it weapons of elegance and confidence, and gifted Hollywood a visual language seared into collective memory. When Richard Gere appeared on screen in an Armani suit, audiences didn't just see an actor, they witnessed a new model of masculinity. When Julia Roberts dazzled at the Oscars in one of his gowns, the world understood that sophistication could be eternal. But Armani also left behind a business legacy. He proved that a designer could be both artist and strategist. He built a multi-billion-dollar empire without betraying his essence, proving that coherence itself could be profitable. In an industry devoured by the speed of trends, he was the exception, the one who endured with the calm of someone who doesn't run because he already knows he's at the finish line. Recognition was universal. Italy revered him as a cultural hero. To the world, Armani represented not just Italian fashion, but the soul of a country that turned restraint into a symbol of luxury. His surname became a language of its own. To say Armani was to say elegance, to speak a universal code understood in every corner of the planet. When news of his death shook the world on the 4th of September 2025, the reaction was unanimous. It wasn't just a designer who had passed, a cultural pillar had fallen. Political leaders, film stars, models, and business titans bowed to his memory. All agreed on one truth. With Giorgio Armani, an unrepeatable chapter in fashion history had closed. His name was carved in stone beside the great creators, but with one crucial difference, none, except him, had managed to keep his kingdom intact until the very last day. That is his true legacy. Armani did not simply create clothes or build an empire. He created an aesthetic language that will endure as long as there are runways, red carpets, and offices where someone must dress in power. His title of Last King is no metaphor, it is reality. He was the last to resist the colonization of corporations, the last to rule his brand as a personal kingdom, the last to prove that independence was possible in a world devoured by giants. And so, Giorgio Armani became more than a designer. He became both a warning and a myth. A warning to those who believe selling out is the only way, and a myth for those who know that true style does not die with time, because its strength lies in what is eternal. On the 4th of September 2025, in his Milan home, Giorgio Armani closed his eyes forever at 91. With him, not only a life ended, but an entire era of fashion. The boy who had been born to the sound of bomb sirens and games among ruins. The young man who once dreamed of being a doctor, but instead built invisible suits of armor, took his leave of the world, leaving behind an empire impossible to replicate. His death did not surprise destiny, but it struck at the very heart of the industry. The headlines did not speak merely of a designer, they spoke of the last king. Because Armani represented something deeper than collections or perfumes, he stood for resistance, for independence, for the proof that one man could construct a coherent universe without bowing to the hunger of corporate giants. But behind the myth lay a price no one could ignore. Armani sacrificed everything: intimacy, love, companionship. He lost Sergio Gagliotti and never again allowed anyone to take that place. He gave up forming a family, gave up heirs of blood. His only descendants were the company, the suits, the hotels, the perfumes that bore his name. And though the world celebrated him as an emperor of luxury, his nights remained solitary, lit only by the glow of a lamp against fabric. That is the eternal dilemma that hovers over his memory. Was it worth it? Is it better to have an empire that defies time, or a life shared in intimacy? Armani never answered aloud, but his work offers the reply he chose. He bet on the eternity of aesthetics, even at the cost of human warmth. Today, every time an executive enters a room in a sober suit, every time a woman feels invincible in a minimalist ensemble, every time someone inhales Acqua di Gio and recalls a fleeting moment of power, Armani's shadow lingers. He did not die, because his symbols remain inscribed in the very fabric of culture. The child of war became the king of sobriety. And though solitude was the price, his empire endures. Giorgio Armani was more than a man, he was a vision that conquered the world and that will go on reigning in silence long after his departure.